Welcome, everybody. We're halfway through the first day of the World Press Freedom Conference 2020. We've seen some really interesting conferences and sessions, and I hope you really stay with us because this is going to be promising and really interesting as well. There's still a lot to talk about. We continue our program with the high-level panel on the safety of journalists. In this panel, we'll speak about some of the main issues for this year's conference, the safety of journalists and the fight against impunity for crimes against them. Because this year, we're not only celebrating World Press Freedom Day, but also the International Day to end impunity for crimes against journalists. This is not something to be too optimistic about because the numbers are really not looking that good. Every week, a journalist is killed for reporting the news. UNESCO reported this year in almost 9 out of 10 cases, the killers go unpunished. Now, I would certainly like the reactions of our panelists on these numbers, but let's first say welcome to them. We already see them. We are very glad to have you with us, to have you here. EU Commission Vice President and Commissioner for Values and Transparency, Ms. Vera Jourova, welcome. UN Special Rapporteur for the Promotion and Protection of Freedom of Opinion and Expression, Ms. Irene Kahn, welcome to you as well. Ms. Amal Clooney of the high-level panel of legal experts on media freedom, nice to have you here as well in the Netherlands. And Mr. Melanio Escobar, journalist from Venezuela, who share a personal perspective of working in a restrictive press freedom environment. And later on as well, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands, Ms. Stef Blok, is joining us as well. But at this moment, he's talking to his colleagues, about 54 colleagues, and he will come over and will tell us about it because they will sign a really important document concerning this subject. Thank you all for being here. Before we dive into the discussion, we have requested Free Press Unlimited. That's an important partner in the Netherlands on the topic of press freedom, to give their perspective on what this panel should address. So let's have a look.
Dear panelists, this year's theme of the World Press Freedom Conference is journalism without fear or favor. Well, on behalf of all the independent journalists, I have a favor to ask.
We need an independent media, and a media that provides ample information to voters as also being fundamental to our democracy.
A lie told a million times becomes a fact.
Poor people are just hit proportionally higher than the rich, and that's something that we should all be reporting on, and at the same time we can't because we all have to stay at home. All in all, I find this a very distressing time for journalism.
Stand in solidarity together, it's now. Particularly also with the coronavirus targeting minority groups, people from Black communities and brown communities, indigenous communities. There's just so much sort of anger, rage, despair about, the injustices that you have to face when you're from a certain community.
Media houses lost revenues and thousands of journalists were fired across the globe. Despite everything, they continued to do their job. Elections and peaceful protests were met with violence, and many of the journalists were even detained, arrested, or harassed. Disinformation and attack on social media criminalize journalists without any accountability.
I get an average of 98 messages per hour.
Journalism has become a dangerous profession.
Recently, we have seen that a journalist from Novaya Gazeta, who was also writing about the COVID approach by Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov, also got death threats, and they pulled that article.
I'm facing almost 100 years in prison, totally.
More than 20 journalists were killed, the majority because they uncovered the inconvenient truth.
We are the ones questioning policies during crisis.
So here's the favor I want to ask you. Investigate and prosecute every attack on every journalist, because these are often the foreshadows of what might become, like murder. Strengthen the judiciary so that they can protect the journalists from harm. Show the political will to make independent journalism a public good. Ensure that journalists can do their job without fear.
doing our job without fear. Wouldn't that be lovely? Before we head into a more active discussion, want to hear from each of our participants. We'll do this by giving each of our panelists first question to respond. And I would start to Mr. Kahn. Your mandate, special report, is to protect and promote freedom of expression worldwide. What do you see as the biggest challenges in the field of freedom of expression these days, and what topics will you highlight in your mandate?
Well, I think
I think we have a sound issue because we don't hear you here. Ms. Kahn, I got to interrupt you because I don't hear you speaking. So I know the guys in the back are really working hard and they're really taking the screwdriver and they're really going to fix it. But let me just move on. I'll come back to you later on and then they can fix your signal. Ms. Jourova, I'll go to you then. Let's bring the European perspective of it all. What challenges is Europe facing internally and externally concerning media freedom, and what does the EU do? Oh, this is interesting. I don't hear you at all. You see, at the end of the day, you do have some technical... There you are. There you go. There you go.
Silenced.
There you go. And now you can start your answer again, please.
Yes, thank you very much. I just said good evening or good afternoon. I don't have good news from Europe because also we have new data which say that the media are not only under economic pressure but also political pressure, threats offline, online against journalists. We have 2 cases of murdered journalists who were assassinated because of them doing the job, and believe me, these were very difficult moments for me in the previous mandate. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, they can hear me. Very difficult moments. I was in Malta, which is the country of Daphne Caruana Galizia, and I was in Slovakia, the country of Jan Kuciak. I spoke to the parents, to the families, and I promised that there will be no impunity. That's why also for me this is a personal case. Up to now, the investigation is ongoing of both murders, and I believe that European Union must not be the place where the journalists are being murdered. But some very unpleasant statistic. We have, since the start of 2020, at least 140 journalists and media workers attacked during the protests in 18 member states. 2/3 of the incidents during the protests involved media workers being attacked or prevented from doing their work by private individuals, such as protesters. 1/3 of the incidents during protests, the source of the threat were police officers or representatives of state security. And we also see verbal attacks from the highest political places, oppositions in some member states, which is a kind of the blessing for the whole society that this is okay to attack the journalists. We have a lot of abusive litigations against the journalists, a lot of problems, and for the first time, the EU is engaging very intensively in this issue of media, and we need media working fully in full speed with good economic conditions, with security. So, but I am a politician, I'm not an analyst, so I have to come with some solutions. Exactly what was said before, we need to guarantee that the journalists do their job without fear. We will issue next year recommendations to the member states who are responsible for guaranteeing security of the citizens to do much more to protect the journalists. There will be very concrete set of recommendations. We will also adopt legislation against abusive litigation. because I think justice has to help journalists being independent, but also not being abused against the journalists. I think that this is quite clear that we have to act. In the meantime, we are funding a lot of legal aid for concrete journalists. We are funding at this moment 2 shelters, one in Leipzig and the other is in Milano, where the journalists who were under the threats can find some temporary housing and many other things. And we cannot do it alone. The Commission, of course, is the executive body of the EU, but we need the member states to also engage and recognize that if the conditions for the journalists are not in their states, there is something wrong with the state, with the democracy. I think that there are many different reasons why the protection of journalists has to be increased.
A lot on your plate for the EU, and then I go to Ms. Kahn again. I think we can hear you now, can we?
I hope so.
Yes, I can hear you very fine. So what do you see as the biggest challenges in the field of freedom of expression these days, and what topic will you highlight in your mandate? And as you answer the question, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Stef Blok, has come in. Welcome, Ms. Blok, as well. Maybe you can answer, Mr. Kahn.
Yes, I think what worries me very much is the political climate. You know, when the largest and oldest democracies in the world seek to denigrate media freedom, then I think we are in deep trouble. And of course, that is a story that encourages others around the world. And what we have seen is actually more attacks against journalists covering protests in recent months, attacks against journalists seeking to speak truth about the response to the pandemic, at a time when people need good factual information. That's precisely the time when it seems that media freedom is being squeezed. And so I worry about it intensely. Over the last decade, about 1,000 journalists have been killed. Many more have been attacked. And ironically, these attacks and killings are taking place more in countries at peace than in countries at war. And of course, international journalists, some of whom you portrayed in the little film, they are well known. But the ones who are dying, most of them are local journalists in faraway remote places. So that's the picture. And the other statistic that we need to know is that very few of these cases are investigated and prosecuted. The rate of impunity is about 88%. That means almost 1 in 10 cases, only 1 in 10 cases is resolved. And that statistic is not just for this year or last year. It has been like that for almost a decade. The needle hasn't moved, and we must do a lot more to create the political will to unblock the lack of capacity, the corruption, ignoring this enormous threat to human rights, to journalists, and to democracy and development. We must move that needle.
Ms. Clooney, Ms. Jourova and Ms. Kahn just explained us this from an intergovernmental perspective. What about individual countries? What can governments do more to better protect journalists, to move the needle?
Well, thank you so much. I've thought about that question a lot. I've defended journalists all over the world who've been unfairly imprisoned just for doing their work. And I think there are 2 main ways in which governments can make a difference. One is they can make sure that their laws are in order. In so many countries around the world, there are still too many laws that allow journalists to be sent to prison for speech, for what they write. To give an extreme example, a blasphemy, insulting religion, is still a crime in 40 countries, and you can get the death penalty for it in 6 countries. Countries all over the world have laws like sedition and criminalizing fake news or defining terrorism extremely broadly. And all of those laws are being used to silence the press. If you think just about the period under COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen journalists in more than 12 countries prosecuted for trying to report on the virus and their government's response to it. So I think the first big issue is reforming laws. And I sit on a panel of lawyers convened at the request of the UK and Canadian governments, and we'll be issuing reports on all of those next year so that states can be guided as to what is acceptable in their legislation. Judges can be guided in interpreting the legislation so that it conforms to international law. The second thing that I think governments can do is, those governments that actually defend freedom of the press, like the Netherlands, can take steps to protect vulnerable journalists and to punish those who abuse them and who abuse the free press. And this legal panel has already issued a number of reports this year that focus on precisely those issues. So for those interested, the reports are already out. But I'll just give you one example. We've said, look, you have to raise the cost for those who are silencing the press all too successfully in all too many places. And one way to do that is to impose targeted financial sanctions and travel bans against those who are, doing this around the world. And I'm delighted that just this week, the EU has actually passed its own legislation that allows it to do that globally. And I think that could be a game changer.
Could you react to that, Mr. Blok? Because what she says is the EU has stepped up his game by doing that. Do you applaud that?
Well, let me first say hello to the panel. Good to see all of you online, and thank you for joining us today. Amal Clooney was referring to the EU sanctions regime that we adopted yesterday, and I'm as happy as she is. As you know, the Netherlands was actually the initiator within the Foreign Affairs Council in the European Union, strongly encouraged by Dutch Parliament, by the US British lawyer, Mr. Browder. But yesterday we achieved unanimity, which is quite a feat in a union of 27. But that means that you really have the power indeed to punish those people that abuse human rights, and indeed it can, and I'm convinced it should be used there where those human rights abuses involve journalists.
Melanio, Escobar, when we talk about issues that journalists are facing, it's important to speak to journalists themselves, like you are. You are a journalist who has been reporting on the developments in Venezuela for years already. You have encountered many difficulties. Let's have a look at some short clips that illustrates what I just said.
Esta es la respuesta del Estado, nuevamente, a quien sale a reclamar su derecho. Estoy en la autopista Francisco Fajardo. Muchas tanquetas, muchos gas lacrimógenos, mucha confusión. La arremetida es directa. No han dejado de avanzar.
Melanio Escobar viene de la organización Humano Derecho.
El uso de los gases lacrimógenos de manera indiscriminada y disparados directamente hacia los manifestantes a quemarropa. La denuncia de la utilización de perdigones adulterados con metras, con tuercas, con tornillos, con piezas de cadenas de moto para causar el mayor daño posible contra quien es disidente a esta dictadura.
Maybe from a really strange point of view, because I'm sitting here in the Netherlands and I never have encountered things like that. I know it exists, but when I see those images and you're talking about screws and marbles, do they actually aim at you?
Yeah, of course. I remember once I was reporting near to my house, my own house. I was covering a demonstration on the main avenue, and the colectivos, those are some kind of urban guerrillas that was started when Chavez was alive, but now they take orders from Maduro's regime, came to end the demonstration. And my wife, that was pregnant at the moment, was watching everything through our apartment windows and started to yell my name, trying to warn me, about their presence. And she started to insulting the colectivos. So they identified me and started shooting at me and my wife, that she was still on the balcony of the apartment. Luckily, no one was hit. with a bullet, but that's not the case of more than 15 journalists in Venezuela that since 2002 until today has been killed because of their work. Actually, a couple days back, a journalist named Jamal was attacked by unknown men. He got 2 bullets on his arm, and this guy is also threw a grenade to him.
Why do you find it important to, I can imagine it, but I would like to hear it from you. Why did you find it important to join this panel and to tell your story?
Let me start by saying that it happens to be me joining this panel, sitting in a safe environment in my exile in Miami, but I want to speak up on behalf of all Venezuelan journalists, some of who are seriously threatened by Maduro's regime and can't even get out of the country, like my good friend Luis Carlos Diaz. He was accused some time ago to be one of the responsible of the famous national blackout. He was disappeared by the political police, and the regime determined that he could be free. But he has to show himself time to time in court. He cannot discuss anything about the case in the media, and he also has a prohibition to travel outside the country. There's been no justice on his case. He's still facing the repression from the regime for just being a very good journalist. Now his story depends on us to be shared because he can't. And because we're speaking about it, this is one of the many ways to silence free press. Using the passport as a repression tool against journalists is something really common in Venezuela. And that's why I'm not there with you at this moment.
Thank you, Melanio, for your stories and what you share with us. I'm going to talk further with your panelists and based on a few propositions. Before we start, I want the audience to know that you can participate in the discussion. Please do. You can ask questions to our panelists by submitting a question in the Ask the Speaker box in your screen. If we have enough time, I do hope so. If we have enough time, at the end of the session, we'll go through some of the questions for the panelists. But without further ado, let's start with Ms. Jourova. My proposition for you is the EU needs better tools to protect journalists under threat by their own government. What is your opinion on that? Ooh, I think your sound is gone again. I'm not sure. Hit something or your computer maybe comes back. Or...
No,
yeah, there you are.
It's
there you are.
My trailer. I am back. Of course, if I say that the EU doesn't need better tools, I would be lying, because we are missing the tools because we see pan-European problem. We see the deterioration of the situation and safety of journalists everywhere in Europe. But we have some countries, I will not name and shame, but we have countries where the high politicians and publicly active people who have influence on public opinion.
You can't say that, but I can say it. You talk. I think I'm thinking about Hungary and Poland, for instance.
Not exactly only these countries. There are some other countries I will not name, but it is a general problem which I always react by not publicly mentoring the
and I think that's really good you do that. I think it's really good you do that, and that's why me as a free journalist can do that. So that's why I call them out. But go ahead.
Well, I think that we have to react, but the tool which I have in hand is only some I don't know, calling the politicians to be maybe more, how to put it, responsible, decent, recognizing the necessity for the journalists to do their job. Of course, I am always defending the journalists who do professional job, which is so important for the society. And we have to decrease the level, of course, also of verbal violence, because this is happening online, and online verbal attacks very often can translate into violence offline, into real violence. One figure, women journalists are particularly under threat. 73% of women journalists participating in a survey by the UNESCO and the International Center for Journalists have experienced online violence in the course of their work. And I mentioned before that we will have an intensive dialogue with the member states. We will issue the recommendation to the member states to strengthen the protection of the journalists. I would like to highlight that some governments are actually doing very good initiatives. Here I will name, because this is a positive example, not because we have the minister here, but the Netherlands has a very interesting initiative which is called Safe Press, bringing together the police, associations of journalists and public authorities to help journalists under threat or attack. In Sweden, national contact points have been set up and more resources allocated to investigate hate crimes. And we need to see more of these kinds of initiatives. And coming back to your question, whether the EU has more tools, maybe not more tools, but we will definitely have more money in the next budget. After we finalize the negotiations on the new budget, there should be 75 million euro in the envelope, which is aimed to help the journalists in their work.
Ms. Clooney, you already said that reforming laws is something that should be done within countries to protect journalists better. Do you see that happening? And when I ask about the proposition in the EU, maybe you can tell us something about the tools you see.
Sure. Well, do I see it happening? I see the legal changes happening in the wrong direction for sure. And, you know, the COVID-19 pandemic has not helped from that perspective, because we know that at least 84 governments have passed emergency legislation giving the executive branch more power. We've seen new laws introduced to criminalize so-called fake news and really misused to define fake as meaning whatever the government doesn't like to hear. And so, you know, I think authoritarian governments and those that are intent on silencing the press are going to do the least that they have to do. And so we have to think always about imposing incentives for good behavior, creating incentives for good behavior and imposing, you know, some kind of penalty for bad behavior. And that's why I think the EU new sanctions regime could be a game changer, because it's a way for this entire bloc of countries to say, if you do this, if you take these steps to silence the press, then you can't open a euro bank account and you won't spend your summer in the south of France. And I think that might, you know, give people pause. You know, other tools, you asked about other tools in the EU. I think there's some really interesting possibilities. For example, the EU has a trade preference scheme that is tied to a country's performance on human rights. And for example, you know, one of the journalists in your video was Maria Ressa. She's one of my clients. She's facing the rest of her life in prison in the Philippines just because she's been a good reporter and she's exposed corruption and human rights abuses by the Duterte regime. Well, at the moment, the Philippines benefits from trade preferences given by the EU. And at some stage, the EU may take the position that, well, maybe they don't deserve it. You know, I don't think there's one package of measures that works for every country. I think you have to take each situation, you know, and think about what's going to be the most effective. And I think you always have to think about ways to target penalties against those who are most responsible for abuses and not, you know, penalize the ordinary person through economic measures. But the EU does have some tools, and often what's missing is just political will or governments making this enough of a priority. And so I'm delighted that Minister Blok is with us and that the Netherlands is hosting this. Thank you for your leadership on this issue. And since we haven't had a chance to say a proper hello, I will say last time I saw you, we were in a room sitting side by side with so many others at the UN General Assembly, and it seems like a lifetime ago. I hope we'll be able to have the next panel under those conditions again.
Mr. Blok, what she says, what Amal says about the political will, for instance, to target certain countries, even if you do have the tool, do you recognize that? Why is it difficult? Can you enlighten us about that a bit?
Well, first of all, let's be hopeful. Yeah. The last time we were together at the United Nations, we spoke about accountability for Syria. And as you probably have seen, since then, Netherlands decided to hold Syria accountable under the International Treaty Against Torture. And for that, we got the support of quite a few countries. That means that there are countries willing to support us when we set such a step. And I just returned from a ministerial meeting. It's actually the first time that we made a combination of a World Press Freedom Conference and a ministerial meeting. And there were...
Over 50?
54 ministers present online from all over the world. And they will all underwrite the Hague Declaration stating that we want to act to protect journalists. And that is, of course, an obligation, but also creates a platform for me or other colleagues to call those ministers, those countries present today, if we want to take a step. It may be with regard to Venezuela, a country that's often on the agenda, especially within the European Union, a country that Netherlands feels closely attached to because of the free islands within our kingdom, close to the Venezuelan shores, a lot of people with family relations with Venezuela. So I hear very clearly what Mr. Escobar said. And I will keep it in mind. The next time Venezuela will be on the agenda. The next time I will speak to the Venezuelan minister, because as they are literally our neighboring country, I have to speak to them. And I always use this occasion to tell them the things they don't want to hear about the freedom of the press, about human rights violation. But indeed, we have to continue to form coalitions, to keep the pressure, and we can only do so if we have our own house in order. Thank you very much, Vera, for your kind words about the Netherlands. But I have to confess, also in the Netherlands, there's violence against journalists. Sometimes by organized crime, sometimes by other people. So we all have to do our homework.
Yeah, I know for sure one of the journalists is being guarded the last 3 years. He can't go out, here in the Netherlands, he can't go out without police protection. And he's been driving around in a protected car. Mr. Escobar, if I can go to you, because we were talking about not only the tools, but also disinformation, fake news is something that's coming up really the past 4 or 5 years. How do you witness disinformation, misinformation, working in Venezuela? Can you enlighten us what you see on that front?
Misinformation is something that has happened for some time ago. It's something that most Venezuelans already know how to battle. Actually, there's a couple of alliances between civil society organizations and independent free media that it's trying to fight against fake news and disinformation. So basically, the problem became itself a solution between all the media and independent journalists, because they are doing this alliance to show people what is really happening behind those fake news. The thing is that the regime controls every regular media, the television outlets, the radio stations, the newspapers. So it's a little bit difficult to do it in a higher level, like nationwide, but for sure, these outlets and this alliance between journalists and civil society is doing the work.
I've got some questions from the audience, and I think it is appropriate to raise those questions. How has the recent rise on the right-wing governments across the world affected journalists? The case of Latin America, for example, most specifically, Brazil comes to mind. And maybe, Mr. Escobar, can start off with you. How has that affected you as a journalist, that the right-wing governments, as they say it here in the question?
About Brazil's right-wing government, I know, look, there's something that most people try to label. It's like left-wing government, right-wing government. At the end, there is repressive governments and free governments that stand for freedom. That's something that is not defined by the political ideals of every leader. That's something that is happening in the region. You find human rights violations and attacks against free press in Colombia. You got those on Venezuela, you got those on Brazil, you got those on Chile, you got those on Mexico. It's not related directly to the people in charge, or the ideology behind the people in charge is about the purpose of this guy in charge, basically.
Ms. Kahn, this question is for you. The lynching of women journalists are massive. The social media are becoming lynching chambers, as the question says here, in the name of nationalism, gender and religion. What are the best ways for South Asian countries to tackle this?
Well, I think a lot of the lynching happens online. And I do want to raise that issue that the social media platforms, the digital platforms, have a responsibility to address this issue of misogyny online. I also think, of course, as Amal mentioned, the laws have to be not only made and reformed, but applied. And that's where we begin to get the problem of impunity. Attacks are not investigated. If there is no investigation, then there is no prosecution, and these kinds of attacks are just buried under the ground. And women, of course, suffer more because these are societies where there is a high level of gender-based violence. And that's why I think that when national systems are not working, then the international community, the international systems have a responsibility. There is no shortage of international standards. That's very, very clear. The international law is very clear about the responsibility of states to address gender-based violence, to address violence against women journalists as well as men journalists. The problem is they don't apply those international laws. And that is where I think the international community can do a lot more. For example, by one of the issues that I and other colleagues in the special rapporteur system have called for is a standing, independent, investigative mechanism that can look at these issues, collect the evidence, that can support our work. We monitor these situations. But who are we? We are actually one individual. We need to have mechanisms, we need to have more resources so that we can go in and look into these issues. And we have shown, my colleague Agnes Kalemar, by investigating the case of Jamal Khashoggi, my predecessor who was on the tape just now, David Kay, has also looked into the situation in Mexico. And I am ready and waiting as soon as COVID-19 allows me to go to many of these countries. But I need resources. I need to be able to access that kind of an independent international investigative mechanism to be able to look into these issues. Because you know, as a journalist, that the way you keep issues alive, the way you push for accountability is by shining the light on these problems. And we need the resource. And here, since Mr. Blok is there, the Netherlands has been very supportive of the High Commissioner's Office. And I hope that the Netherlands will also support the special procedures to get more resources to be able to investigate these cases and to make it such that governments cannot turn a blind eye to attacks. They will have to move and do something about it.
Maybe we can give an example because Ms. Amal Clooney, you were talking about one of your clients, Maria Reza. She was on this afternoon. She's facing, as she told, and you told, 100 years of prison. What can we do in such a case like Maria's?
Thank you. You know, it's funny, apparently I forgot, but she reminded me the other day that I delivered the news as to the maximum sentence she was facing on Christmas Eve. And it wasn't good news. You know, it was basically the news to say, if you're prosecuted, if you're convicted on all the charges that you're facing, you're going to be in prison for decades. And what has she done? She just was a reporter like any reporter worth their salt in the Philippines. There are going to be stories about, you know, a drug war that has killed so many civilians, about corruption in the country. But they're going after her with, you know, she's already been convicted and sentenced to up to 6 years for an article that appeared on her site because you can impose criminal penalties for defamation in the Philippines, and she's facing a whole host of bogus charges. And so, you know, I think we've talked about some of the things that can be done to help journalists like Maria in terms of punishing the perpetrators through economic measures or sanctions. I completely agree with Ms. Kahn that there's also a lot more that can be done by, again, press defending nations to investigate these kinds of attacks and give resources. You know, there was a mention of the Jamal Khashoggi investigation. I think that's actually a good example of how the system doesn't work as well as it should. You know, we had a Washington Post columnist tortured, murdered, and dismembered in a consulate in Istanbul, and there's been very little consequence. And, you know, there was a UN rapporteur who did, you know, a very rigorous job in trying to document what she could, but she didn't have the resources that she didn't have a team of forensic investigators. You know, by the time she was able to go to Istanbul, much of the evidence had already, you know, disappeared or been destroyed. And so I think we can do better than that. And I think we, you know, there are so many resolutions and declarations and speeches, but what we actually need is, you know, real advances on things like investigations, on things like sanctions. And I'll give you another example of something that's really not that difficult for governments to do, but could also be a game changer. Governments could help journalists who need to escape from a situation of danger. You know, we heard earlier that often you have all these warning signs with hate on social media and various threats. We saw the warning signs for Daphne Caruana Galizia in Malta. Nothing was done, and she was blown up in a car bomb in Europe. So one thing that countries can do is say, okay, if you're a journalist in danger, we are going to give you an emergency visa, and you will be able to escape from that danger and come to this country. And, you know, it's not that difficult for a Western democracy to say every year we will let in 50 journalists who meet this criteria. And that would actually, if 10 countries gave 50 visas like that, that would cover all the journalists who today we believe are behind bars because of just doing their work. And I don't see why that can't be done. I'll give you another example. I represented Reuters journalists who were imprisoned in Myanmar for reporting on the genocide against the Rohingya. And they were imprisoned. They are now in Canada because Canada gave them a visa, you know, a student visa. So it's not ideal. They still can't work, but at least they're safe and at least they're out.
I'll give you now an example as well, because we have an example on the panel. And I don't hope it comes to that, Mr. Escobar, but talking about warning signals, you have been called out and threatened live on television. And we have that footage where you are being threatened. Just have a look at this footage.
No respetado. Yo me acuerdo cuando Fede Guevara, que me decían bolso. Ah, bolsa, cállate, saco. A Pizarro. Pizarro por dar una entrevista. Ese es un protocomunista, muy corroto. Mira, Pizarro, vuelve la polla Records. ¿Oíste? ¿Cómo se llama el otro chamo que es punqueto también, que se la pasaba con Eduardo Loyo en Bogotá ahorita, me dijiste en estos días? Ah, Melanio. Vuelve la polla Records para ver si se vuelven a oxigenar su cerebro y se vuelven de izquierda. Punquetos de derecha, no lo entiendo. Están juntados con la avenida principal del Jersey. Mira,
So we don't know the context. We don't know these people. You could maybe think it's a comic show because they're laughing. But what does it actually mean, what they just said to you? Because they're really calling you out personally.
Basically, what she said was she was using kind of a criminal slang. What she meant is that I'm looking for trouble for what I'm doing. But being called out in national television, in our own state media outlet, it's something that should be really warning. It's a great warning sign for any journalist that maybe he needs to realize that he's no longer safe where he is. So this is something that happens a lot in Venezuela. It's not something that happened to me. It happens all the time in national television. The regime uses all the media outlets to call out against journalists. It happened a lot during the COVID-19. the beginning of the crisis, when journalists were reporting about the cases and the waves and everything, they used all the medias to try to make them look bad. So the news wasn't that strong about COVID-19.
Time is really flying, panel. Only one question last. And I really think it's an interesting question to any of you, actually. So if you want to answer it, just raise your hand. How do we persuade the public to care about this issue? Starting in school, question mark? Ms. Jourova?
Yes, this is a big question, because we are also working on how to fight against disinformation, and one of the plans of the EU is to make the people more resilient and better prepared for this new era, not to believe everything they read on internet mainly, and to be more, how to say, hungry for objective fact-based information. And here comes professional journalism and the work of journalists, which should be definitely, which should get better recognition in the society. So we have in our plan some support, also financial support of education, of awareness raising work with the civil society, but it's a long distance run, and I don't want to sound pessimistic, but it's necessary.
It's a marathon. I would really like to thank you, Amal Clooney, Ms. Kahn, Ms. Jourova, and Mr. Escobar. Thank you so much for joining us here on this special panel. But stay on to listen maybe to the minister, because he's got really nice things to say about what happened just with 54. Now, the minister, you just said something about it already. Foreign ministers were present at the... That's an advantage, actually, that you don't have the people in here. So the bar is low, as you have 54 ministers. Can you tell us why it was so important for the Netherlands to have this meeting?
Well, of course, you know our famous football player, Johan Cruyff.
I know him.
Who famously said, every disadvantage has its advantage.
Yes.
And today was such a day, because originally we intended to have a live meeting with ministers present, but I have to confess, then we wouldn't have 54 ministers present. And it is so important to me, because I need the joint efforts of ministers to achieve anything within the European Union as our close neighbors. But what was especially important to me was that there were so many countries present that don't figure themselves, let's say, in the top 10 of the freedom of the press list, but still were joining us, still have underwritten the declaration. So me and my colleagues can call them whenever necessary and say, we were so glad to have you with us on The Hague on the 9th of December, and now we call on you to stand with us again. And that we will certainly do.
And of course, my job is not only to listen and applaud, but also be skeptical and critical. So when you have the document, which is really fine and beautiful, but what's the value of it, really looking at the society? And how does it work, such a document?
I cannot exactly foretell how it will be used, but I know it can be used. And Amal mentioned the important achievement of the human rights sanction regime. Of course, a lot of people have been working on it for years, and people said it will never, ever happen. And it happened, which means that we will use it. This morning I spoke to young journalists, students, some of them from countries that want to become members of the European Union. I know not everything is perfect within the European Union, but if you aspire to become a member, we require respect for human rights, the rule of law, and freedom of the media. And the fact that countries are aspiring gives us leverage to set such a step. So, yes, there is a lot to be pessimistic about, but also reasons for optimism. So let's stick to that.
Thank you. And I think, so what's next? The document is there, it's signed, you've explained the value, and what's next?
There are some practical steps apart from the document. As Netherlands, we promised to the United Nations to donate extra money. for training, for protection of journalists. We decided to enlarge our Shelter City program, actually a program like the one Amal Clooney spoke about, to provide safety to human rights defenders and journalists in need. And there is still a lot of unknown homework. The unknown homework based on the Hague Declaration of today, which obliges us to take action whenever we see journalists under threat. Because we signed the declaration, we have to step up.
Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, again, for joining us at this panel. Today, for this part, I'm done here. Tomorrow, we'll have an interview, for instance, with the widow, Amal Clooney was talking about it, the widow of Mr. Khashoggi, who was being murdered in 2018. We'll be talking about her fight for his values still going strong. Thank you for now, and hope to see you tomorrow. And stay tuned for other programs today as well, here at the World Press Freedom Conference 2020 in The Hague. Thank you, and see you tomorrow.